from the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
I welcome each of you to our program number 2 of a series entitled Journey Through Time, the Historical Human Quest for the Good Life. On part 2, our sub-area is going to be titled The Historical Human Quest for Freedom and Justice. And we're very, very pleased to have as our guest a very distinguished historical figure. We welcome to the program Thomas Jefferson. He is being portrayed by that very well-known scholar, Dr. Clay Jenkinson, and Dr. Jenkinson is a Rhodes Scholar. He is an author, he's a historian, and he's very well known in the United States as the leading Chautauqua performer in this country. He has performed in front of great audiences, including the last 2 presidents of the United States. And today we want to welcome him in that capacity as Thomas Jefferson. As most of you know, Mr. Jefferson was a very distinguished American as governor of Virginia. He was the United States minister to France. He was United States Secretary of State under George Washington. He was Vice President of the United States under John Adams. And he became President of the United States and served from 1801 until 1809. He was also the author of the Declaration of Independence and the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom. He is also known as the father of the University of Virginia. Our guest has always been described as an architect, a naturalist, an author, a linguist, a lawyer, and a planner. President Jefferson, it's great to welcome you to our program, and for viewers who were not with us last year, you were here last year. We had the opportunity to come to Virginia, to your home, and to interview you today. You're in our studio, and welcome back as we talk about freedom and justice. We are delighted to have the 3rd president with us.
Thank you.
And as always, I'm very pleased to have our 2 regular panelists, Janelle Burke, who is an attorney in the state of Idaho, and next to her is Steve Schenck, who is the Dean of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College, and we'll ask Janelle to ask the first series of questions to President Jefferson.
You are one of the people who are often considered to be in the foremost of the movement for freedom. Many people idolize you for your work in that field, but exactly how do you define freedom? And then secondly, what were the major impacts on your life that had a great impact on your development of that definition of freedom?
Well, in a state of nature, before societies, we have a complete complement of freedoms. We're free to do anything we want. But when we enter society, the ideal is to retain as many of our liberties as we can and to entrust as few as possible to the state. And the best societies are those that are quite close to anarchy. The basic freedom is freedom of association, freedom of conscience, freedom of expression, freedom from oppressive government, from too much regulation, from taxation. We also have certain freedoms like the freedom from unreasonable searches and seizures, the freedom from self-incrimination, etc. So freedom begins with freedom of mind. That's the most important one of all. But we also need fundamental political freedoms, and thereafter we are free to define happiness in the way that best suits us.
What matters impacted on your life to help you develop this kind of a definition of freedom?
Well, in a sense, I was a child of fortune because I was born in the late Enlightenment in a country that had not yet really gelled. So I was the inheritor of the Enlightenment tradition, which was obsessed with freedoms. But we weren't born in France or Scotland or Prussia, where those freedoms were almost impossible to secure because of the long history, the spasmodic history of oppression. Here we were a new people, carrying new concepts to a new continent. So we had an automatic, structural freedom that no people had ever had before. In Europe, men like myself were satirists. They were often persecuted. They often died in jail. In the United States, a man of my sort could be a statesman. So I was fortunate in that regard. I lived at a good time in a perfect place. But secondly, I read books. I had a mentor at the College of William and Mary in Virginia when I was 17 who introduced me to the great texts of the Enlightenment. And I would call myself, rather than an instinctive radical of the sort that Thomas Paine was or Patrick Henry, I was a rationalist radical. I gained my radical political ideas from books. And I lived in the great age of books, the first time in human history when books were widespreadly available to young minds.
Steve Sheen.
Mr. President, we have sort of two topics in this segment of our program, freedom and justice. Does one necessarily follow from another? In other words, if you create a free society, will it be a just society? Maybe you could share with us some of your views about that.
That's a difficult question. They sometimes overlap and they sometimes don't. You cannot have justice in the society unless you allow each individual as much freedom as possible. So that's a basis for a society of justice. But once you have that tradition of rough equality in the economy and perfect equality in the machine of the law, then the question becomes how shall people interact with each other? And the danger is, and this is the sort of danger that Alexander Hamilton was constantly pointing to, what if the people freely choose to oppress a minority? And that's a difficult problem in a free society. So too much freedom, according to the conservatives, can lead to license or oppression. That doesn't tend to be my view. My view is that in the long run, a self-governing society will be self-correcting. There will be mistakes, of course, but citizens gathered in majority rule will do more justice and good sense than in any other form of government one can imagine, and its errors will be short-lived and self-correcting. On the other hand, I do think that freedom is in some regards antithetical to justice because justice is a communitarian concept. It requires a high level of cooperation, and freedom as it is often understood via John Locke is freedom from authority, not freedom to associate in a gregarious and benevolent fashion. So I think this is a balance that is very difficult to maintain. My only certain view is that a hierarchical society with a central government of the kind that Hamilton wanted is not a good guarantor of freedom or justice.
And if I can follow up quickly,
Yes, please.
You've given us sort of the philosophical underpinnings of your beliefs about freedom and about justice. Now, if you would, rank the America that you govern as president in those two categories.
The freest, most just society that ever existed on the face of the planet.
And is it where you would like it to be?
No. We could have gone farther. I was the first to advocate universal manhood suffrage. There were always property qualifications during my lifetime. I knew we had to free the slaves. I said nothing is more certain in the book of fate than that this people must and will be free. I died and slavery was more deeply entrenched than it was at my childhood. I believe that we should extend modest rights of legal equality, rights of inheritance, rights of education to women. That was stillborn in most places in the United States. And perhaps most important, I believe that you cannot be a free society unless you emphasize public education for all. And I was the first American to advocate a general bill for the more general diffusion of knowledge, but I died in a Virginia that had no public schools. So we were very far from realizing the Enlightenment tradition. But compared to any other country that had ever existed, even Great Britain in our time, we were infinitely ahead of all others.
Thank you.
President Jefferson, you certainly have been credited, and it has been well documented that you are the author of the Declaration of Independence, and very little assistance came from any other quarter. It was mostly a look at some grammatical questions and somewhat a little bit of reduction in the document itself. As a student of that document, one can certainly understand that freedom was at the heart of the document, along with an issue of equality, and it has inspired many generations since your lifetime. But yet let's return to whether or not you were totally consistent with the words of that incredible political essay. Again, you have already indicated today that you had slaves, I believe about 200 in your lifetime. Could you explain to us in modern times how you resolve this conflict between what I would consider probably the greatest political essay of history with some of your actions as owner of slaves?
Well, there are many answers to that, and correct me if I stray. But first of all, let's just say that you must grade me with some judgment for my personal behavior. That surely does not act as a commentary on the justice of the Declaration of Independence. In other words, it may be that my ideas are much greater than I am. So let's at least leave that possibility open. Secondly, the original Declaration of Independence had a long paragraph accusing George III of personally waging war against human nature itself by perpetuating the slave trade. Now, that was the slave trade and not slavery per se. But had that paragraph been allowed to stand, it would have shown that the concept, all men are created equal, was deliberately targeted to blacks too, not just to whites. So that offended me when it was expunged at the insistence of the Carolinas and Georgia. I felt this was a way to wedge the issue of emancipation into our primary national document. So if we had my Declaration of Independence rather than the one that Congress promulgated, perhaps there would be a little less confusion about this subject. And third, I should say, when I say all men are created equal, what I meant primarily was all human societies have a right to govern themselves without outside interference. So men here is to be defined as the community. We were objecting to Britain's virtual representation of us from 3,000 miles away. And the Declaration of Independence is a kind of Aristotelian syllogism. It says, under certain conditions, people have a right to rise up and overthrow their government. Those conditions have been met. Therefore, we have no choice but logically to rise up and overthrow our government. Once we are free from Britain, we have an enormous amount of internal work to do to bring about Enlightenment conditions. But you cannot even talk about slavery until you are free from George III and the Parliament of England.
For a point of clarification, you have indicated that some crucial language in your document was removed, but after that was removed, the document still was your work, just some omissions, as you've indicated.
Yes, Dr. Franklin made several important suggestions, and so did my friend John Adams. But the Declaration of Independence, as you have it in your time, is my document with some omissions brought about by the lack of moral courage in the Congress, particularly at the insistence of the slave states, South Carolina and Georgia, and several religious pieties that were intruded upon an otherwise deistic text.
I also want to recognize the influence that you had, even though I was asking you to deal with this, what appears to be an important contradiction. The influence that you had, however, even though this section dealing with slave trade was removed, is it not correct that your beloved country of Virginia was the first place to address this issue? And did you not have influence from what you had attempted to do?
I led the charge in Virginia to allow emancipation on a plantation-by-plantation basis. That one failed, but I also encouraged Virginia to be the first commonwealth in the world's history to outlaw the slave trade, and we did, well before the United States did and well before the British Empire did. So our record is a mixed one on this question. We are far from perfect. I myself was a slaveholder. I was an apartheidist. I was a racist. But I also knew that in the long run you cannot espouse certain fundamental traditions and then violate them without it degrading your social fabric and degrading your character. I said that Samuel Johnson, the British moralist, was certainly right when he said in 1777, "Isn't it interesting that those who yelp loudest for liberty are also the drivers of Negro slaves?"
I hesitate to ask this next question from previous conversations I've had with you, Mr. President, but when you speak of your time and we ask you to act and respond to certain actions of today, I know that you don't like for the dead to determine the future. However, in spite of that reservation that you have, would you comment on the fact that the Declaration of Independence, along with, I would argue for the position, the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom that you authored, have impacted in such a way, and how would you react to what it has done around the world, not only the United States, but such countries as South Africa?
Well, I knew in my final letter, which was written 10 days before my death in 1826, that the meaning of my life had been to articulate certain principles of natural law, the Declaration of Independence, and that fire which I helped to ignite in the United States was going to go around the entire planet and liberate peoples everywhere. So it's not at all surprising. It has nothing to do with me. I'm merely the distiller of ideas which are beyond any human achievement. These are ideas that go back as far as Aristotle and beyond. What I brought to the process was what John Adams called a peculiar felicity for expression. And that's useful too, because lucidly articulated truths are more potent than if Milton had written them or John Adams had written them. So that matters. And it strikes me as the greatest satisfaction that my words, all men are created equal, have been used by women to liberate themselves, have been used by Negroes to liberate themselves, have been used by every insurgency movement in the history of the world since my time. That gives me satisfaction because I found the language that is now vital to all peoples who wish to be free. I might not agree with the causes every time, but I know there is no limit to how widely this net can be strewn over human tyranny.
Janelle Burke.
So difficult to decide what to ask you when we have you sitting right here and we're able to talk with you about so many important events. But I do want to talk a little bit about religion and your views about freedom of religion. You were very instrumental in drafting legislation. What was the nature of religious practice in your day, and how did you view it?
Well, when I died in 1826, there were several states that still had official religions. So there were theocracies in the United States, if you can imagine it. Virginia, when I was born, had an official church. I disestablished it with the Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty, and I went on to espouse the disestablishment of all state churches everywhere. The standard in my time was tolerance. There was usually an official church, but then it tolerated the Quakers and it tolerated the Methodists. They often couldn't hold public office, but at least they weren't actively persecuted. I consider that to be a woefully insufficient standard. In my view, whether I believe in one God or 20 or none at all, neither picks your pocket nor breaks your leg, and therefore in some technical sense is none of your business. And I believe we must have a high wall of separation between church and state, and that your religious views, be they Mohammedan, Hindu, or atheist, must never bring you civil rewards or civil penalties. I created that standard in the Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty, and it was one of the 3 achievements for which I wished most to be remembered. As president, I received a letter from a religious group asking me to declare a national day of thanksgiving and prayer, and I refused. I said, if you wish to give thanks, do. The United States government delivers the mail. It does justice. It builds roads, but it does not enter into your private conscience.
Steve Sheen.
Mr. President, you mentioned 3 accomplishments for which you'd most like to be remembered. What are the others?
The Declaration of Independence, of course, 1776. The Virginia Statute for Religious Liberty, 1786, which really was my most original achievement and the one in Europe for which I gained the most fame. And finally, most interesting to me, the University of Virginia at Charlottesville. I believed in the general diffusion of knowledge, and I actually would have preferred primary public schools to a university. But the university was all that the state was willing to fund in my time, and it became the darling hobby of my retirement. I know that we cannot be a nation ignorant and free. And so education is really the basis for continuing this tradition which we set in motion in 1776. And I was so proud to live long enough not only to survey the site for the university and to design its buildings and supervise their actual construction under Palladian architectural terms, but then to interview the first class of students and to hire the faculty and even to order the books for the library. Someone later than my time said, an institution is the lengthened shadow of one man. Well, if ever that was the case, it was the University of Virginia, and it is exactly a symbol of everything that I stood for: the unlimited search for truth, the belief that reason can liberate us, and the belief that education is the very center of a democratic society.
You just gave us the 3 accomplishments you're most proud of. Could you do the same for the things you failed to accomplish?
Well, I was an inveterate optimist, and in my own lifetime I would not have answered such a question because I like to keep hope ahead and put fear astern. But in the name of candor, I will say that the way that I went after Aaron Burr during the Burr treason trial did my reputation no good and probably showed a bit of fanaticism and illiberalism. I should also say that the embargo, which was the last policy of my second administration, in which I tried an economic embargo as an alternative to war with Britain, could only be enforced with executive authorities which I would have been frightened of had they been shown by any other administration than my own. So those are 2. And more personally, I should have resisted the call to public office. Happiness is to be pursued at home. I called the presidency splendid misery, and I'm glad that I served my country and did so with some distinction. But I said in a letter to DuPont at the end of my 2 terms as president, nature fitted me to be a scientist by rendering that my supreme delight. Only the emergencies of the times in which I have lived have turned me from my passion, which is agriculture and science and letters, to the disagreeable burden of politics.
Thank you.
Mr. President, there was a great debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists as we were considering the adoption of the Constitution following the Constitutional Convention, and the Anti-Federalists, that you'd be very proud of the fact, I would assume, that they insisted upon some additional considerations of the Bill of Rights. And of course, the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights, as we have lived in modern times, has really encompassed the concept of freedom. Would you like to speak to Mr. Mason's idea and James Madison and how they contributed to this? And
I was not at the Constitutional Convention. I was in Europe.
yes,
But I watched the process with some interest. And when James Madison and two others sent me a draft in September of 1787, I was frankly appalled by it. It was too energetic a constitution, for one thing. I preferred the good old venerable Articles of Confederation. But here's what really troubled me. We lived in the age of the Enlightenment, and the 55 demigods who met in Philadelphia produced a new instrument for the United States without enshrining our rights. I was only angry 3 or 4 times in my whole life, but this was indeed one of them. And I wrote to Madison, my closest friend and my protege, from Paris, and I said, what every people on earth has a right to expect against its government is a Bill of Rights. This can never be left to inference. It's not implied in this or any other constitution. It must be spelled out in plain English, and any constitution that does not contain a Bill of Rights is void under natural law. Well, eventually, in 4 carefully argued letters, I wore Mr. Madison down and convinced him to champion a Bill of Rights. Meanwhile, his constituents in Virginia had been making much the same argument. He became the father of the Bill of Rights. He gathered some 88 proposed amendments to the Constitution from around the country. He reduced that number to 18. Congress reduced it again to 12. Those 12 proposed amendments were promulgated, and on the 15th of December, 1791, Virginia became the state which led to the ratification of those 10 amendments. The Bill of Rights, in my opinion, is more important than the Constitution. And the First Amendment is, of course, the most important of all. The second most important is the 10th, which says that those powers not delegated to the national government belong instead to the states and to the people.
if the Federalists and Mr. Hamilton in particular had prevailed and the amendments would not have been opposed, of course we understand in modern history that the Constitution would probably not have been approved without that agreement, but let's suppose it had. With your wisdom and your knowledge of the political process, what do you think would have happened to the new country?
The country wouldn't have survived, because when the first great crisis came in 1798, when the Adams administration attempted to breach the freedom of expression that we are all entitled to by nature and nature's God with the Alien and Sedition Acts, and the people were able to oppose that unconstitutional legislation by pointing to a text, to the First Amendment. So if there hadn't been this articulation of natural rights, I think we would have failed as a nation. On the other hand, Mr. Madison was quite right when he said, it's only an articulation of rights which exist anyway. And I trust the American people. I believe they would have demanded a due respect for their rights. It might not have been as easy as it was, lacking a text and lacking a formal articulation. But I think the American people understand intuitively what matters, and they would have insisted upon it. But it might have come with blood rather than with argument.
Janelle Burke.
At the beginning of the Declaration of Independence, you say all men are created equal. What does equality mean to you?
Equality means two things. Identical treatment in the machine of the law, Jew or Gentile, rich or poor, man or woman, and theoretically black or white or red. That the accident of your birth must not influence your treatment in the law. The law should be a mere machine. And secondly, equality means rough equality of economic opportunity. That everyone born, and this is from John Locke, has a right to subsistence, either to a farm or to the financial equivalents of a farm. But no one can be denied minimal economic security by accident of birth. We have a natural right to some subsistence. And when those two conditions are met, identical treatment in the machine of the law and roughly equal economic opportunity for all, then I will say, like the character in the New Testament, nunc dimittis, now you may dismiss me, my work is done.
And what do you think of the case of Marbury versus Madison?
You know, in my own lifetime, I wasn't particularly upset by the worst of it. historically, the worst of it historically is that it imposed judicial review on our Constitution, which was not frankly contemplated at the Constitutional Convention. My cousin, John Marshall, that gloomy malignity, traveled out of the case and insisted upon this notion that 9 unelected, unaccountable, and unimpeachable beings can overturn the will of the people as articulated in Congress. But at the time I wasn't particularly concerned about that, and the next case of judicial review didn't occur for 50 years. What troubled me was that he traveled out of the case to lecture my administration and say that we had a moral right to have given this commission to a non-entity, William Marbury. John Adams, when he was discredited by the sovereign, by the people, spent his last hours as president filling every office he could with arch-federalists, known enemies to me. And he was so troubled by what he took to be my revolutionary potential as his successor that he signed so many commissions that they couldn't physically be delivered to every intended arch-federalist recipient. I accepted all of his midnight appointments that had actually gotten into the hands of the intended, but those few that were still on the desk, I said, let us simply discard. And then William Marbury sued for a writ of mandamus to get his commission, and my administration simply ignored him, and the Supreme Court knew that if it ruled that we must give him the commission, I'd simply ignore that, and it would destroy the court. So Justice Marshall sided with me in the end, but not until he had lectured me from time to time, which I consider to be deeply offensive.
Steve Sheen.
A quick question. You say you're an optimist. Are you optimistic that the American people can continue to preserve the gift of freedom that you've given them?
Absolutely. The fire that was lit in 1776 will never disappear from the globe. My last letter comes right to the point. I looked back on 50 years of commitment to liberty, and I said, all eyes are opening to the rights of man. The gradual spread of the light of science has already laid open to every view this truth, that the mass of men were not born with saddles on their backs, nor a favored few, booted and spurred, ready to ride them legitimately by the grace of God. Let this, I said, be the ground of hope for others, and this will never end until every person on earth is free, some sooner, some later, but all in the end.
On that note, we had to bring our program to conclusion. President Thomas Jefferson, we thank you for being with us. As always, you are totally inspiring, and we appreciate your time.
Thank you, citizen.
Ladies and gentlemen, you have been viewing program number 2 of an 8-week series entitled Journey Through Time, the Historical Human Quest for the Good Life. Today's program has been about freedom and justice, discussing this issue with Thomas Jefferson. Please be with us again next week. Until then, have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Instructional Technology on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.